The call came on a Tuesday morning in February 2009. Not to regulators, not to journalists, to the investors themselves, thousands of them, scattered across Houston, Miami, Caracas, and Antigua. Their broker was telling them calmly that their certificates of deposit had been frozen, that their savings, in some cases their entire retirement, were locked inside a bank on a small Caribbean island that was now surrounded by federal agents. Nobody was getting their money back. Not today, not ever. And the man who took it, he was still out there. This is the story of Alan Stanford, a man who built a $7.2 billion empire on nothing more than forged numbers, rented prestige, and an ego so enormous it functioned almost like a force of gravity. This is the story of how he did it for nearly 2 decades, and why, for nearly 2 decades, nobody stopped him. Robert Allen Stanford was born on March 24, 1950, in Mexia, Texas. Population, 8,000. The kind of town where ambition has nowhere to go but out. He was not born wealthy. He was not born connected. What he was born with was a face that looked like it belonged on the cover of a financial magazine. Square jaw, silver hair, the practiced confidence of a man who had decided very early that he would never be small again. By the mid-1980s, Stanford had tried and failed at a gym business in Waco. He watched it collapse, but instead of retreating, he recalibrated. In 1986, he moved to Montserrat in the Caribbean and acquired a small bank with money borrowed from his father, James Stanford. He renamed it Guardian International Bank. He had almost no clients and very little capital. But he had a vision: sell certificates of deposit to wealthy Latin Americans who wanted their money somewhere safe, somewhere offshore, somewhere the IRS couldn't easily see, and he understood something crucial. These clients didn't just want returns, they wanted to feel chosen. He would give them that. By 1990, Stanford had moved his operation to Antigua, where the regulatory environment was, to use the generous word, flexible. He renamed the entity Stanford International Bank. He built an actual building, glass and steel, impressive by island standards. He hired staff who wore blazers. He had letterhead printed on heavy cream paper that felt expensive between your fingers, and he began promising something almost no legitimate bank was offering: consistent returns of 10 to 15% annually on CDs, year after year, regardless of what the market was doing. Back in Houston, he opened Stanford Financial Group, the American arm, the respectable face. He dressed it in mahogany and soft lighting. The offices on Galleria Boulevard smelled of leather and faintly of cologne. Advisors wore cufflinks. They spoke in measured tones about diversification and safety. They were selling a product backed by a bank on an island most of their clients had never visited, and most of those clients never would. Here is the mechanism of the lie, stripped bare. Stanford International Bank took in investor money, eventually over $7.2 billion of it, and issued CDs promising those extraordinary returns. The returns were supposedly generated by a sophisticated portfolio of global investments managed by a secret team of analysts. That portfolio barely existed. The money was not being invested. It was being used to pay earlier investors, classic Ponzi architecture, and to fund Alan Stanford's personal mythology. And that mythology was staggering. By the early 2000s, Stanford was spending approximately $50 million a year on himself. He owned a fleet of private jets. He owned a 112-foot yacht named the Sea Eagle. He funded the Stanford 2020 cricket tournament, an entire international sporting competition, as a branding exercise. In 2008, he landed a helicopter on Lord's Cricket Ground in London and walked out carrying a briefcase containing $20 million in cash. Live television, cameras everywhere. The cricket world was scandalized. Financial journalists glanced up, then looked away. Nobody asked where the money came from. Nobody asked. The Securities and Exchange Commission had been asking, quietly, ineffectively, for years. A financial examiner named Leila Basagoitia flagged Stanford's operation in 1997. She noted the impossibly consistent returns. She noted the offshore opacity. She filed a report recommending investigation. Her superiors did not act. In 2002, the SEC's Fort Worth office opened a formal inquiry. They found indications of fraud. They did not pursue it. In 2004, examiner Julie Prowse submitted a detailed memo describing Stanford's CDs as, in her own words, a likely Ponzi scheme. Her supervisors once again shelved the report. Later investigations would reveal that the Fort Worth regional office was plagued by mismanagement, and that its enforcement head, Spencer Barash, repeatedly declined to pursue Stanford, then left the SEC, and attempted to represent Stanford as a private attorney. He was later fined $50,000 for that conflict. For the people who lost their savings, that number has a particular bitterness to it. Meanwhile, Stanford was accreting legitimacy like a barnacle collects weight. He was knighted by the government of Antigua in 2006, becoming Sir Alan Stanford. He donated generously to American politicians on both sides of the aisle, at least $2.4 million in federal political contributions. He sponsored conferences. He attended charity galas. His photograph appeared in the same frames as senators and prime ministers. When you can make power smile for a camera, power tends to look the other way. But the machine had a fundamental flaw. It needed new money, constantly, relentlessly, to keep paying the old money. And by late 2008, the machine was choking. The global financial crisis had spooked investors everywhere. Withdrawals from Stanford International Bank spiked. New deposits slowed. For the first time, the inflow and outflow were badly mismatched. Stanford began moving money desperately between accounts, between entities, between islands. His CFO, James M. Davis, a college friend from Baylor University who had known about the fraud from nearly the beginning, was keeping the books on a fiction that was now physically collapsing. Davis would later testify that he had first understood the CDs were fraudulent back in the early 1990s. He stayed. He said Stanford was intimidating. He said he was scared. He stayed for 20 years. On February 10, 2009, SEC investigators arrived at Stanford Financial Group's Houston offices and served the company with an emergency asset freeze order. The building on Galleria Boulevard was shut down within hours. Employees arrived for work the next morning to find the doors locked and federal agents in the lobby. Some of them learned their paychecks had bounced. Some had invested their own savings in the CDs they had been selling to clients. The victims were selling to victims. Alan Stanford was not in Houston. He was in the U.S. Virgin Islands. FBI agents located him on February 27, 2009, on Frederiksted Beach on St. Croix. He was served with civil fraud charges on a dirt road near the water. He did not run. He reportedly asked the agent serving him if there was any way to avoid this. There was not. He was not yet under criminal arrest. That would come later. So he returned to Virginia, where he had been staying. He gave an interview to an ABC news producer in which he denied everything. He sounded almost confused, as if the accusation were the absurdity. The criminal indictment came on June 18, 2009. 14 counts. Mail fraud, wire fraud, obstruction of justice, money laundering. Stanford was arrested in Stafford, Virginia, on Route 1, a strip of chain restaurants and gas stations with nothing to recommend it. They took him in a dark blue FBI windbreaker over a white T-shirt. He looked diminished. The square jaw was there, the silver hair, but the frame that had filled rooms and intimidated regulators and charmed cricket boards looked ordinary on the side of that road. Just a man, just a thief. The trial began on January 23, 2012, in Houston Federal Court. Stanford had claimed he was too mentally impaired to stand trial. A head injury from a 2009 prison fight, genuine by medical accounts, complicated by a documented addiction to anti-anxiety medication. Judge David Hittner ruled he was competent. Stanford sat through proceedings in a grey suit that seemed slightly too large for him now. He fired his lawyers twice. He disrupted proceedings. He appeared to those in the courtroom like a man who still could not fully accept that the world had stopped believing him. James Davis pleaded guilty before trial. He testified against Stanford in exchange for a reduced sentence. He described in precise and devastating detail how the two of them had fabricated the investment portfolio documents, how the so-called diversified global investments were largely a fiction, how Stanford had personally diverted at least $2 billion of investor funds to himself. Davis received 6 years. Stanford's chief investment officer, Laura Pendergast Holt, also pleaded guilty to obstruction. She received 3 years. On March 6, 2012, the jury convicted Alan Stanford on 13 of 14 counts. The courtroom was quiet when the verdict was read. Several victims in the gallery were crying, not with relief, with exhaustion. There is a particular grief that comes not from losing something, but from learning you were never holding what you thought you had. On June 14, 2012, Judge Hittner sentenced Alan Stanford to 110 years in federal prison. At the sentencing hearing, victim after victim approached the microphone. A Venezuelan businessman named Gustavo Leal had lost $4 million, his family's entire liquid savings. A retired schoolteacher from Louisiana named Angela Shaw had lost $330,000. Shaw had become a victims advocate, founding the Stanford Financial Victims Coalition, fighting for years to recover what she could from the frozen assets. She told the court that Stanford had destroyed families, that several victims had died waiting for resolution, that at least 2 had taken their own lives. The recovery process was grotesque in its slowness. Ralph Janvey was appointed as receiver to identify and claw back Stanford's assets. What he found, properties, planes, yachts, and bank accounts spread across 12 countries. The Sea Eagle had been sold. Many accounts had been drained. By 2022, over a decade after the collapse, roughly $500 million had been returned to victims out of the $7.2 billion lost. Approximately 7 cents on the dollar. Most victims never recovered financially. Many never recovered at all. Alan Stanford is currently incarcerated at the United States Penitentiary in Coleman, Florida. He is 74 years old. He has filed multiple appeals, all denied. He has maintained, in letters and through intermediaries, that he was wrongfully convicted, that the SEC destroyed his legitimate business, that the Ponzi scheme narrative is a construction. He will die in that prison. The math on 110 years does not work out in his favor. There is something specific that stays with you about this case. It is not the scale, though the scale is enormous. It is not the duration, though nearly 20 years of uninterrupted fraud is staggering. It is this: the SEC knew. They were told in 1997. They were told again in 2002 and again in 2004. Leila Basagoitia wrote a report. Julie Prowse wrote a memo. Both women identified the fraud precisely, clinically, correctly. Both were ignored, and for 12 more years after Prowse's memo, 20,000 people continued trusting their savings to Alan Stanford's fiction. Nobody sent them a warning. Nobody was required to. And so the file just sat there, growing thicker, gathering dust, while somewhere in the Caribbean, a man in a blazer shook hands and smiled and signed his name to paper that was worth nothing at all.